appalled by the brutal killing of George Floyd and the suffering of other victims of racially motivated violence. Our thoughts are with their families. The last words of George Floyd, "I can't breathe," echoed around the world as a rallying cry for equality and human dignity. We express our strong support to all those who are peacefully protesting to end racism. We unequivocally condemn racist violence, racism and all forms of discrimination, including by the police and others in position of authority, against people of African descent and other persons belonging to minorities. We need to act urgently to tackle the scourge of structural racism and discrimination. However, let's be clear. Racism is not limited to one country in the world, but it is a global problem. Therefore, the international community cannot remain silent, and we welcome this opportunity for the Human Rights Council to reaffirm our joint commitment for action. Austria would also like to reiterate its support for the work of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Madam President, peaceful protests should not be hijacked by those seeking violence. We are concerned about incidents and attacks by the police as well as demonstrators against journalists and the media covering these protests. Against this background, we would like to reiterate that a free press constitutes a fundamental pillar of any democracy. It must be safeguarded at all times, and journalists must be free to report without facing violence, arrest, or intimidation. We trust that the de-escalation of tensions will prevail, and we remain confident that the US authorities will ensure a swift investigation and fair trial in full respect of the rule of law and human rights. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and I pass the floor to Denmark.
President, Denmark aligns itself with the statement made by the EU. Denmark would like to thank the group of African countries for initiating today's debate. The developments around the world show that it is indeed an important and timely discussion. Denmark strongly condemns racial discrimination and racially motivated violence. Such acts violate basic human rights and must not be tolerated in any parts of the world. Sadly, the reality is that they do happen in all parts of the world. The tragic death of George Floyd reminds us of that. Like people in the United States, we were saddened by his death while in police custody, and we express our condolences to the family. We note that the competent authorities have taken steps to investigate the circumstances. Ensuring full transparency and prosecution of criminal acts is fundamental to ensuring justice in respect for universal human rights. All governments must act to prevent and denounce state-authorized excessive use of force, especially by law enforcement personnel. Law enforcement authorities must be well-trained, professional, and act in accordance with international rights obligations. We are pleased to note positive public mobilization against racism in the recent weeks in all parts of the world. The freedom to peaceful assembly as well as freedom of expression are fundamental to ensuring inclusive and tolerant societies. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And the next speaker is Qatar.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we'd like to express our principled opposition denouncing all racial and racial practices, and those are based on racial discrimination without respect to who perpetrates it. Non-discrimination is an international obligation contained in all human rights instruments. These are principles that are form of the principle of the rule of law. Therefore, any kind of impunity for racially insinuated crimes undermines the rule of law and encourages the repeat of such crimes. That also negatively reflects on security and peaceful coexistence. Numerous tragedies that are facing in the world today are based on racial practices in certain societies in the world because of their ethnicity or probably their religion. And despite the efforts undertaken over the past decades to establish the principles of equality and coexistence, racial discrimination has re-emerged over the past period across the world. The minorities, refugees, and displaced persons are being violated. Their rights are being violated on a daily basis because of the hate-based positions against them and the propaganda made by certain parties in order to make gains out of this. Based on our firm conviction that racism and racial discrimination run counter to the human rights principles and the United Nations Charter, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international instruments, this Council should remain seized with this situation and take concrete action to counter them and not only to inveigh against them. Measures must be taken to combat discriminatory aspects, in addition to providing remedies to the victims, along with integrating educational curricula in the law enforcement institutes, particularly as regards human rights and combating discrimination. Lastly, effective remedies must be given. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation fully associated itself with the statement made by the distinguished representative of Central African Republic on behalf of the group of African states. My delegation would like to join its voice to that of the world community in paying tribute to the victims of racism and their families. We would also like to denounce and condemn this blatant violation of basic human rights that occurs in various parts of the world, including the developed and democratic countries. Madam President, today the world is facing another worse enemy which is more robust and dangerous than the COVID-19. It hurts people in a discriminatory manner in the past. It continues to do so today. It might also hurt tomorrow if we remain silent and observer. This enemy is racism with all its faults. Unfortunately, the primary victims of this evil are minority groups such as refugees, asylum seekers, people of African descent. Despite the existence of many legal instruments at national, regional, and international level, people are still suffering from injustice, atrocity relating to racial discrimination. The tragic death, the senseless killing of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis in the United States is a perfect example that reminds us of all this sad reality. The abuse of power and the violence that are happening in full view of everyone demonstrate once again the fragility, ineffectiveness of our current justice system and protection for the victim of human rights violation. Madam President, there are many things that need to be done in this issue, and we believe that the Human Rights Council has a moral duty to find a durable solution to the root causes and consequences of racial profiling. This august body has also the mandate to promote and protect the human rights for everyone, including those who are victims of systemic racism, police brutality, and the violence in general. Madam President, we heard the heartfelt message of the family of George Floyd. They are waiting our help. Let us unite our effort to assist them in their legitimate battle for the justice. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Sudan.
Shukran.
Thank you, Madam President. Sudan associates itself with the statements made on behalf of the African group as well as other groups it belongs to. We welcome the high-level participation from the African Union and the United Nations and the High Commissioner, at this session, which is devoted to the discussion of human rights violations due to police brutality. We welcome the holding of this urgent debate at this time. The Human Rights Council could not remain silent in the face of these gross violations, where thousands of people have called for the rejection of these racist incidents that are perpetrated against Africans and people of African descent in many parts of the world. Madam President, the tragic killing of George Floyd has revealed the need for authorities in many parts of the world in which similar incidents have taken place, the need to monitor the brutal behavior and unjustified use of force by security forces against civilians and people of African descent. We must promote cooperation to ensure that countries have the necessary effective machinery to address the root causes of these acts that undermine the dignity of people of African descent, such as racism, stigmatization, discrimination, and denying them the rights that are guaranteed by virtue of all international instruments and conventions. Madam President, the December Revolution in my country aimed at putting an end to violations, to combat discrimination and racism. We shall take additional measures in accordance with the policies of the transitional government, which has agreed to open an OHCHR bureau office in order to promote human rights in the country. Madam President, yesterday we discussed under item 9 the Durban Program and Plan of Action. Many states had supported the Durban Working Group and its work to combat racism. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we now hear from the Philippines. It's actually a video statement, which we have found meanwhile.
Thank you, Madam President. There has been little dispute about technical cooperation as an important aspect of the work of the Council and of the OHCHR that advances our shared goal to promote and protect human rights. We welcome the focus duly given by the OHCHR to technical cooperation and to forging partnerships with countries in this regard. We join calls for this focus. I
think we need to stop this. This is the wrong video.
Budget constraints. We believe that this focus should be reflected accordingly and clearly in the budget and program of the OHCHR in terms
May I ask technicians to stop this? I think it's the video on another item. I'm very sorry to the Philippines. We'll try to... Okay, I propose that we are moving to the list of observer states, and while we wait for the right Filipino video to be found. And we start with UN Women, please. That's another video statement. I hope it's the correct one.
Madam President, distinguished delegates, UN Women believes that women are part of their lived experiences. These experiences impact on who they become, as well as on their families. These may be religious, these may be racial, cultural, or sexual orientation. The working group of experts on people of African descent have highlighted that girls and women of African descent are likely to be poorer, less educated, and with less opportunities everywhere in the world. We are now seeing outpouring solidarity, as well as people protesting in the streets against systemic as well as brutal racism. We need to fight against racism too in our own institutions and everywhere in the world, because only if we are united we will build back together after COVID. In fighting apartheid, it took people of the world also to be in solidarity and to fight together and help to end apartheid. This time has come again. We must be united to end racism as well as gender inequality in the world.
Thank you. And we now hear from Jordan.
In the name of God, Madam President, our council is held today in response to protests sweeping in multiple countries of the world. We have to understand that racism and other forms of discrimination are still rampant, are still persistent, despite the fact that they are prohibited in international and national laws. The best way to ensure a flourishing life for the generations to come based on equality, justice, and the rule of law shall always be through instilling the noble values in the younger generations in education, and secondly, through applying the rule of law to all, and third, making effective legal investigations in the racism and racial discrimination related incidents. Thirdly, through awareness-raising programs online about the racial and discrimination threats that undermine all societies, no matter how rich it is. In conclusion, we call upon all countries and governments to respect the legislations and legal principles that criminalizes racism in all its forms that violate human rights, and to give effect to the lofty principles contained in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ICERD, as well as the other instruments, legal instruments. And thank you, Madam President.
Speaker Sweden.
Thank you, Madam President. Sweden aligns itself with the statement made by the EU. Let me begin by reaffirming our determination to combat all forms of racism. Racism, xenophobia, and prejudice restrict people's lives and create a breeding ground for violence and hate crime. This is unacceptable. Ultimately, these acts constitute threats not only to individuals, but also to our societies and to democracy. As partners, we have watched recent events in the US with pain. We all have a responsibility to fight racism. None of our countries is immune. Safeguarding journalists is key, as well as protecting the rights and safety of people to voice their concerns. We take note that the competent authorities in the US have taken steps to investigate the circumstances surrounding George Floyd's death and to ensure full transparency. We as states need to become better at identifying all forms of discrimination, racism, and similar forms of hostility in order to expose, confront, and adopt measures to combat it. We will continue to work tirelessly to this end. I thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. The DPRK delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the NAM, and we support the African group in initiating these urgent debates at the Human Rights Council. We are deeply concerned and strongly condemn the continuing racial discriminatory and violent practice against African and people of African descent and structural racism endemic in the United States and other parts of the world. The current tragedy disclosed obviously against chronic racial discrimination, social inequality, and institutional defects in the United States. The systematic racial discrimination in the United States constitutes the world's hottest human rights issue, as it is a violation of the international human rights instruments, including the ICERD and the DPA. The Human Rights Council should react to the systematic racial discrimination practice of the United States with rigorous approach, righteous standpoint, and action-oriented measures against racial discrimination. We urge the United States to implement its international obligation, eliminate root causes of racism, racial discrimination, and other human rights violations, and guarantee the legitimate rights of the people of African descent and other ethnic minorities. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Doy la palabra a Cuba.
I give the floor to Cuba. Madam President, we appreciate this urgent debate being convened, and we appreciate the leadership from the African group in this initiative. Nearly 2 decades after the Durban Conference, the scourge of racism, discrimination, and xenophobia continued to advance in a world ever more unequal, caught in multiple and complex crises. Let us not fool ourselves. The abominable assassination of George Floyd in the United States is not an isolated act. It is part of a saga, a consistent saga of human rights violations based on the color of skin and ethnic origin. These are shrouded in centuries of structural racism and profound economic inequality and inequality in distribution of income. This perpetuates the political, social, and legal system in that country. It is founded on slavery, the privilege of the elites, and the plundering of the majority. The reality is that racism and political violence against Afro-descendants and minorities are not exceptions or errors in the system. They are part and parcel to the system. We hope that these unfortunate events mark a before and after in the future of the fight against racism, discrimination, and ill treatment of Afro-descendants. Madam President, I conclude reiterating the call to implement the DPRK and to adopt those actions that allow us once and for all to all be treated equally. You all be able to count on Cuba evermore in this noble effort. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador.
Go to Seychelles.
Madam President, the government of Seychelles observes with consternation the systemic racial injustice against people of African descent and the protests held across the world in outrage and opposition. We take this opportunity to express our sadness and sympathy with the victims of these injustices and their families. Racially motivated human rights violations have no place in any society that aims to be based upon the principles of tolerance, respect for human dignity, and the rule of law. As an African state populated by a meld of ethnicities, Seychelles' constitution proudly recognizes that as descendants of different races, we have learned to live together as one nation and to serve as an example of a harmonious multiracial society. We are proud of our heritage, Madam President, but we remain conscious that the fight against racism is not achieved by proclamations and words alone. It has become essential for all of us, as countries, as communities, as businesses, and as individuals, to look inwards, to reflect, and to put in place concrete and sustainable paths of action to address systemic racism wherever it occurs. We look forward to supporting the initiatives of the Human Rights Council to constructively address the situation in the United States of America, as well as the insidious trails of racism and xenophobia in our global community. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Botswana.
Thank you, Madam President. The horrific images we witnessed on our television screens on 25th May 2020, when George Floyd was killed while begging for breath, a basic requirement for life, reminded all of us that the sacred pledge of all humanity is to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, unquote. Awakened by the near possibility of becoming complicit in the monstrosity and repeat acts of impunity, the global masses chose to stand up against the tragic passing of George Floyd. A rare but welcome chorus of voices responded and called out injustices and brutality faced by Africans and people of African descent on a daily basis. The protests forced all of us to look in the mirror and introspect on the state of the world, reflected also in the horrors of slavery, colonialism, apartheid, among others. Botswana has in this council and elsewhere maintained a consistent position of placing the highest premium on protection against abuses and safeguarding the interests of victims of human rights by whoever, wherever, and whenever they occur. This debate on an issue that has gripped the world's attention in the past few weeks is unfortunately not an isolated event and has happened in many parts of the world. What remains unique this time is the solidarity portrayed by people of all races and different backgrounds in every corner of the world. Today, we seek the same solidarity among us as member states of the UN through a recommitment to our international obligations and addressing racism and racial discrimination. At the end of this urgent debate, we hope to adopt a resolution that reflects the outcome of today's historic deliberations, which will faithfully reflect this Council's disapproval of human rights violations. It will be up to all of us here to prove that the Human Rights Council will not be relegated to being a passive observer and that we will never take sides with an unjust system. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We pass to Sierra Leone.
Madam President, my delegation would like to thank the Council for holding this urgent debate. Racially motivated human rights violations, systemic racism, and police brutality against Africans and people of African descent appear to be on the rise. This has been a problem all over the world, and we are now particularly concerned with the recent and unfolding events, including the gruesome killing by police of George Floyd and the excessive use of force against protesters. This singular incident has now focused the world's attention to this pernicious problem, and we must use it to address that problem in a decisive manner. We share the call by the UN High Commissioner on Special Procedures to end racial discrimination by law enforcement agencies and for the structural problems that has given rise to the global protest to be meaningfully addressed. In this regard, Sierra Leone urges the Council and all members of states to support the resolution tabled by the African group. We urge all states to urgently address with greater resolve and political will all forms and manifestation of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and effectively implement the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and the outcome of document of the Durban Review Conference. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Et je donne la parole à la France.
I give the floor now to France. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to thank the Africa Group for holding this important debate, which you are presiding over so well. I would like also to take this opportunity to present our most sincere condolences to the family of George Floyd. I understand some members are here present or represented. Madam President, the protest movement, which is shaking the entire world today, reminds us that racist acts, discrimination, hate speech, and violence have no place in our societies, and the struggle for justice and equality must continue every day. My country can only welcome this universal and eminently democratic movement in which citizens of all the countries of the world have demonstrated so clearly that justice must go together with the enjoyment of fundamental freedoms. The government of France is uncompromising in the face of racism, anti-Semitism, and other discrimination. Because the members of the law enforcement are a part of society, they are not impervious to these evils, the evils that our societies suffer from. When racist acts or speech is committed, those responsible must be identified and crimes must be punished, because it is vital that the law enforcement must be exemplary. This is vital. Some decisions have already been announced in France beyond the usual disciplinary or judiciary investigations. Measures of precautionary suspension must be systematically be considered, whether as racist or sexist acts. Xenophobia, hatred, and violence must be fought, and France will take its place in this collective struggle to build a more fair and peaceful society where the dignity, history, and identity of all can be recognized. Racism will not pass. Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to Belgium.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President.
Statement. Belgium welcomes the convening of this urgent debate. Racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia continue to affect us all. No country can claim to be free of the scourge of racism. Recent tragic images culminated in renewed calls for decisive action led by the Black Lives Matter movement. Those events also stimulated ongoing public debate in Belgium. We do not turn a blind eye to part of our history nor to current forms of racial discrimination. Last year, our Prime Minister apologized to people born to white fathers and African mothers during the Belgian colonization for the injustices they suffered. He expressed the wish that these apologies would be a further step towards raising awareness about this part of Belgium's history and would strengthen Belgium's determination to continue to fight against all forms of discrimination, racism, and xenophobia. Following last year's visit of the Working Group for People of African Descent, Belgium acknowledged the existence of contemporary forms of racial discrimination, particularly in the field of housing, employment, and education. Belgium pledges to strengthen its effort to combat racial discrimination. In February 2020, an interministerial conference to combat racism was established with a view to elaborate a national plan of action. At the eve of the 20th anniversary of the Durban Conference Against Racism, we hope that we will all stand up together against racism and turn the fundamental equality of all human beings into a reality for each and every one of us. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci beaucoup. I give the floor to Lichtenstein.
Thank you, Madam President, for giving me the floor. We thank the African Group for requesting this urgent debate on the current racially inspired human rights violations, systemic racism, police brutality, and the violence against peaceful protesters. As a matter of principle, Liechtenstein condemns all forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, stigmatization, and related intolerance. The COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the recent peaceful protests that took place in many countries in order to express sympathy with the Black Lives Matter movement, show that more needs to be done to tackle all forms of discrimination with regard to ensuring the enjoyment of all human rights for all without any kind of distinction. We would like to stress that the importance for states to take necessary measures to design and fully implement effective policies and programs to prevent, detect, and ensure accountability for misconduct, including violence by police officers and other enforcement personnel, which is motivated by racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, stigmatization, and related tolerance, and to prosecute perpetrators to such misconduct. Furthermore, we would like to reiterate that it is crucial that the right of peaceful assembly and association can be exercised freely. We reject any form of violence carried out by protesters and police forces during such peaceful protests. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I pass the floor to South Africa.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation aligns itself with a statement made by the African Group and the Non-Aligned Movement. We are moved, Madam President, that as the Special Rapporteur on Racism recalled, we meet just a day after June the 16th, when 44 years ago, in 1976, unarmed children in Soweto were fired at and many killed by the apartheid regime, a nuclear weapon state, for daring to stand up for their humanity, and they were shot because they were African. As the Deputy Secretary General said, we must wage a sacred war against racism, so that the chilling images we saw in recent weeks do not take us back to the horror of Soweto in 1976, thereby tearing open wounds that we thought were healing. George Floyd's last words were, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe, officer, I can't breathe." I thank the Human Rights Council for having heard these words of anguish as Mr. Floyd's life was being extinguished in front of our eyes. Indeed, the Human Rights Council must be the ultimate defender of the weak and do so particularly for the descendants and the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. We all have a responsibility not to minimize the issue, not to generalize the issue, and not to diminish it, because that would be a form of racism in itself. We therefore hope that members of this Council will not balk at the resolution tabled by the African Group and adopted by consensus, which will place this Council on the right side of history and recommit it to the DPRK. In conclusion, Madam President, we mourn the death of George Floyd and others, and thank you from the bottom of our heart for your leadership.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I hope I'm not promising too much, but we hope to now hear from the Philippines.
Madam President, as a party to the ICERD, the Philippines actively supports UN initiatives to combat racism and prevent its occurrence. We welcome this urgent debate as it affirms the consonance of the Human Rights Council with communities across nations, painfully reawakened by recent incidents, to the reality that much remains to be done in eliminating all forms and practices of discrimination on the basis of race. There are remaining structural issues to address, including, regrettably, vestiges of colonialism in parts of the world. The Council has considered reports from treaty bodies and special procedures on systemic racism and xenophobia, especially in developed states involving people of African descent. Through the UPR process, states have engaged constructively to recommend measures at the national level to address this issue. The Philippines sees the value of evidence-based monitoring and evaluation and review systems embedded in the police force and relevant oversight bodies, in ensuring that there is no systemic or institutionally sanctioned racism or use of excessive force in law enforcement. Consistent with its human rights policing and its zero-tolerance policy for impunity, the Philippine National Police has embarked on putting in place a real-time data recording and analysis system for its 205,000 officers in 1,766 police stations nationwide. This monitoring tool will use real-time data on complaints of human rights violations and on the status of investigations and cases to enable the police force to respond with timely interventions and to better protect human rights and prevent violations. We recognize the role of the Council, as well as of treaty bodies and the OHCHR, in fully mainstreaming human rights in the work of law enforcers and security authorities. We note that in its 2019 annual report, the OHCHR's technical cooperation with law enforcers comprised a significant part of its work, primarily in developing countries. We highly encourage the consideration of similar projects to address systemic racism and structural discrimination and police brutality involving people of African descent in various countries where these are occurring. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, and apologies to the Philippines. We now give the floor to the United Nations Population Fund, which is again a video message.
I thank the Human Rights Council for holding this urgent debate. We're living through turbulent times. Protests have flared across the world as people cry out for justice. We join them in saying, Black Lives Matter. UNFPA reaffirms our commitment to the United Nations Charter towards an end to all forms of racism, discrimination, and marginalization. To deliver faster on the 2030 Agenda and the Nairobi Summit ICPD 25 commitments, UNFPA is intensifying our work during this, the decade of people of African descent. We're scaling up programs to empower women, girls, and young people of African descent. As someone with the good fortune to be African Panamanian myself, I know that this initiative will have profound meaning and inspire people of all races and ethnicities, of all backgrounds, to promote and achieve the Sustainable Development Goal of just, peaceful, and inclusive societies and institutions. Building an equal society begins with each of us. May recent events serve as a catalyst for countries to abolish long-standing inequalities and dismantle any remaining systemic barriers preventing marginalized communities from attaining their full human rights. We look forward to the positive results of this much-needed debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam High Commissioner. Syria aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of NAM. We commend the initiative by the African Group for holding this urgent debate, which comes at times when racial discrimination and systemic racially motivated human rights violations are on the rise in some parts of the world, particularly in the United States. The killing of Mr. George Floyd was a tragic reminder of chronic racial discrimination, police brutality, and social inequalities targeting minorities in the U.S. We condemn this abhorrent crime and express our sincere condolences to the Floyd family. This urgent debate and the draft resolution proposed by the African Group should send a strong message that racially inspired violations shall not be tolerated. To this end, we continue to believe that the establishment of an independent international COI remains a step in the right direction. We express our concern over the resurgence of contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and deplore the use of social media platforms to promote racially inspired violence. We call on all states to effectively implement the Durban Declaration and POA and the Durban Review Conference outcome document. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. The next speaker is Jamaica.
Madam President, Jamaica welcomes this urgent debate and joins in expressing its grave concern regarding the contemporary manifestations of systemic and structural racism, racial discrimination, and related intolerance in all its forms, as exhibited towards Afro-descendants, minorities, and people of color, violating their right to life, to fair and equal treatment before the law, and depriving them of their fundamental rights as enshrined in international human rights law. For decades, people of African descent and other minorities have had to live the harsh realities of institutional and other forms of racism. Recent events have served to underscore the growing concern with this issue. Given its long history of slavery, Jamaica takes very seriously its commitments under the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action and the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which prohibit racism and racial discrimination in all its forms. Jamaica further reaffirms its unequivocal support for the International Decade for People of African Descent, which seeks to guarantee the full and equal participation of Afro-descendants in all aspects of society. We urge all members of the international community to take immediate and decisive action to ensure that perpetrators of racially motivated violence and other injustices are brought to account, as well as that other tangible actions are taken towards the dismantling of structural and systemic forms of racism. The full text of this statement will be available on the extranet. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Morocco.
Morocco aligns itself with all those who have spoken out strongly against racism and the acts of violence that flow from racism. As representatives of diverse peoples in the Mediterranean, the Kingdom of Morocco has deep values of tolerance, coexistence, and recognition of the other. We condemn all forms of racism. We believe that this should be an opportunity for us, members of the Council, to take hold of the international momentum and to make this fight against racism an urgent priority for us all. Morocco is taking a non-conflictual, pragmatic approach to implementing measures to support all the appropriate mechanisms, and indeed even new procedures, to clearly and precisely identify all forms of repression and police brutality that are caused by racism. Also, with regards to identity and the even catastrophic circumstances created not just for the victims because of their origins or the color of their skin, but also for public order, peace and security, regionally and even internationally. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Ambassador.
Speaker is the United Nations Children's Fund.
For over 70 years, UNICEF's work around the world has focused on supporting the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of all the rights of all children everywhere. In doing so, our work has sought to end, prevent, and address the prevailing and systemic discriminations of every kind, including racism, that take place on a daily basis globally. We have witnessed how racism, xenophobia, discrimination, and violence have caused trauma, harm, and disruptions to the life of millions of children and their families, and have continuously led to violations of their rights. UNICEF is deeply concerned about the disproportionate and harmful impact on children who are still in evolving stages of physical and emotional maturity and development. These compounding experiences risk negatively shaping the way children see themselves, the world, and their place in it far into the future. It is critical that immediate measures are taken to combat and address racial discrimination, as well as other forms of discrimination, violence, and hate speech. Over recent weeks and months, hundreds of thousands of people, including children and young people, have taken to the street to demand an end to inequality, including racism. Children have a right to safely share their views on issues concerning them and to be heard, and rights to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. UNICEF urges states to proactively ensure that children can exercise these rights in a safe and peaceful manner, that they be heard, and that every child can live and grow to her or his full potential, free of any discrimination of any kind. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the African Group for initiating this historic, urgent debate on an issue which relates to us all as human race. Mr. George Floyd's public execution in the hands of a policeman is indicative of the breadth and depth of institutionalized racism and racial profiling that have worsened constantly over the past 5 decades, distancing America further from Martin Luther King's ideal of beloved community. Many similar cases have happened without being documented or publicized. As noted by Washington Post, George Floyd serves as a literal embodiment of the thousands of black men who have been killed by law enforcement over the course of American history, who are destined to remain in anonymity. The long history of racial superiority, dating far back to colonial era and slavery, have paved the way for modern-day police brutality at home and aggressive belligerent policies and bullying abroad. Resorting to wholesale coercion of all sorts against other nations and peoples is the practical outcome of this inhuman attitude. We won't escape racial superiority without mindset unless and until we target its roots. Combating racism requires a genuine collective endeavors by us all to cultivate a culture of inherent equality of humankind and rejection of any sort of superiority. We are duty-bound to reverse the normalization of racial superiority and brutality, both at home and at the international level. This is the evil that has long sought to destroy the prospects for organized human life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next speaker is Egypt.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. يضم وفد مصر صوته إلى البيان المجموع.
The Egyptian delegation endorses the statement from NAM and by the African Group. We would, however, like to add the following comments. My delegation hails the holding of this urgent debate. My delegation is extremely concerned over the violations victimizing people of African descent in the Western world. The international legal structure in the fight against racial discrimination and intolerance is a solid foundation for ensuring a respect for human rights for all. We urge the countries of the West to respect their commitments that arise from relevant instruments and charters. We would like to insist on the need to launch a dialogue. This would be aimed at putting an end to the violations of the rights of persons of African descent. We encourage the Western countries to undertake technical cooperation programs with the High Commissioner's Office to ensure that a respect for human rights is given by law enforcement officers. We encourage these countries to cooperate with these mechanisms, and specifically those that address racial discrimination. There should be complementary norms for the instrument for the elimination of all forms of discrimination.
Madam President, Canadians have joined their voices with others around the world to demand that entrenched systemic racism and discrimination be dismantled. Racism denies people their dignity and rights. Its pernicious effects are witnessed in gross inequities across all aspects of life, including criminal justice, health, and education. COVID-19 has exacerbated existing racial inequities, while catalyzing new and odious forms of xenophobia and scapegoating. Canada strives to be an inclusive country that respects diversity, but we recognize that systemic racism and discrimination in Canada continues to be a reality faced by Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, and other racialized Canadians. There is still work to do. That is why Canada launched a federal anti-racism strategy in 2019, designed through meetings and consultations and informed by people with lived experiences. We cannot ignore systemic racism. There are no easy fixes. Uprooting systemic racism will require courageous and sustained commitment from all quarters of society. It will require all of us to call out racism and challenge prejudice and unconscious bias in our own lives and in the structures of society. A truly inclusive society that values diversity must include a wide range of voices, paying particular attention to those who have borne the heaviest burdens of racism. Canada is ready to do this work together with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And the next speaker is Colombia.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. Colombia appreciates the convening of this urgent debate promoted by the African Group. The aim is to recognize that racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia continue to be the cause of human rights violations. They bring suffering and violence around the world. My country condemns the acts of racism and xenophobia committed against Africans, people of African descent, or any other person for reasons related to the color of their skin, their religious beliefs, their opinions, or because of who they choose to love. States and the international human rights system should continue to fight this scourge. They should condemn any act of violence committed by, in an arbitrary manner by the police or military. In no case should disproportionate violence remain marked by impunity. Colombia supports the firmness of the aspirations of all peoples of the world to achieve justice, equality of opportunity, and full enjoyment of human rights with no discrimination. Free and democratic societies are based on a respect and protection of the inherent dignity of each individual without distinction. My country is undertaking great efforts to make progress in the promotion and full guarantee of human rights for all of our residents in Colombia. The Colombian state has the firm goal and political will to eliminate all forms of discrimination. We also have the political will and goal of driving forth changes that will knock down the walls of racism, xenophobia, and stereotypes, building equity and opportunities for the citizenry. Thank you. Thank you.
Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we would like to express our deepest condolences to the families and loved ones of all those who have been killed as a result of police brutality and racially motivated crimes driven by supremacist ideologies in the United States. We would like to pay tribute to all those who fight against such oppression, discrimination, and injustice. We support convening the urgent debate to address the structural racism and discrimination that prevails around the world, with a tremendously negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights. The brutal images we are witnessing today in the United States and other parts of the world have rightfully inspired a global outrage at racial oppression, in particular against people of African descent, which has been systematic. This racially motivated violence should not just merely be condemned. We have a moral and legal obligation to speak for the silenced voices and ensure effective, concrete responses that would contribute to fight systemic racism and the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. In this regard, we believe that an investigation and concrete action by the Human Rights Council is long overdue, as this issue has been ongoing for centuries. At the moment, some lives matter more than others. That is racism. That is unacceptable. Here, we reiterate that the lives of people of African descent matter too. Black lives matter. I thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Sri Lanka.
Madam President, Sri Lanka considers this urgent debate an important and timely decision by the Human Rights Council. We thank the African Group for proposing this initiative. As of today, we have passed several centuries since the inception of the modern notion of human rights and 75 years since its consolidation and proliferation through the UN Charter, followed by a series of core human rights instruments. While some progress has been made, events that occur from time to time, including the recent racially inspired human rights violations against persons of African descent, serve as a grim reminder that beneath the surface of perceived equality, centuries-long systemic prejudices and discrimination persist against some segments of the world population, in particular persons of African descent and people of different socially constructed notions of color. As a country that had been subject to centuries of colonialism and as a co-sponsor of the historic 1955 Bandung Conference, which brought Asian and African leaders together in their call for equality among all races, Sri Lanka stands in solidarity with the African Group in their call to address these issues which impact on the enjoyment of human rights by people of African descent. In this regard, Sri Lanka associates itself with the statement delivered by the non-aligned movement. While expressions of solidarity are important, Sri Lanka strongly feels that it is through action at international level that we will be able to turn the International Decade for People of African Descent into a sincere and meaningful effort at ensuring recognition, justice, and development for persons of African descent. In conclusion, my delegation, while recalling Sri Lanka's active role in negotiations on the outcome document of the Durban Review Conference, wish to affirm Sri Lanka's commitment to the core principles of equality and non-discrimination embodied in the DDPA. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lesotho.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation aligns itself with a statement made by Beginner First on behalf of the African Group. We welcome every presentation by the panelists. The world cannot condone racism at all costs in this day and age. The death of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement agencies in the United States is just but one of the many brutal deaths, violence and hatred perpetrated against people of African descent across the globe. My delegation categorically denounces such acts. Madam President, people of African descent suffer systemic racism and police brutality day in and day out. As such, Lesotho reiterates what was said 50 years ago at the Organization of African Unity Summit in Cairo. Malcolm X, on behalf of the Organization of African American Unity, gave a historic speech intended to bring awareness of the discrimination experienced by African Americans. In his speech, he noted, and I quote, "Your problems will never be fully solved until ours are solved. You will never be fully respected until we are too respected. You will never be recognized as free human beings until we too are recognized and treated as free human beings. Our problems is your problem. It is neither a black problem nor a specifically American problem. It is a global problem, a problem that involves all of humanity. It is not a civil rights problem, but a human rights problem. While expressing our sadness and sympathy, we are of the view that the world can use this difficult time to reflect on the actions we can take to tackle and to put an end to racism and all forms of discrimination and prejudice against people of African descent. We strongly believe that states should criminalize all forms of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobic attacks. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and may I appeal again to delegations to respect the time limit because we still have quite a list of speakers. Having said that, I turn to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, the Russian delegation has on many occasions called the attention of the international human rights structures to the factors behind the monstrous murder of George Floyd. Racism, police tyranny and lawlessness have become systemic for a long time ago in the USA. Washington has ignored for decades the fair criticism from the international community. The USA has refused to participate in the majority of international human rights treaties and boycotted the work of the HRC. However, they continue to consistently criticize other states on human rights issues. The confidence of the American administration in their own infallibility, impunity, and messianic role in many ways led to this tragedy. For so many times, we have called the USA to correct the calamitous state of affairs in the human rights and take heed of the opinion of their own people and respected international institutions. Russia knows what racism leads to when it's raised to the status of political doctrine. We remember the Second World War and attempts to rewrite that history. An uncompromising struggle against modern forms of racism, including such ugly ones as neo-Nazism, should be a priority for the international community today. Today's situation is an ominous warning. Violence and vandalism during protests are not acceptable and must be prosecuted under the law, but all of this could have been avoided by building a non-discriminatory social model built on true equality and respect where there is no room for chauvinism or racial intolerance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And the next speaker is China.
Thank you, Madam President. China is always opposed to all forms of racism and racial discrimination and supports the call of the African Group for an urgent debate at the Council. We are saddened and shocked by the death of Floyd, and we offer our sincere condolences to the bereaved family. Life is the most precious, and Black lives matter. As stated by Madame Bachelet, the High Commissioner, and experts of many special mechanisms, the incident of Floyd was not an isolated case. It highlights the chronic and deep-rooted racial discrimination, police brutality, and social inequality in the U.S. We urge the United States to heed the calls of the international community, effectively implement its international human rights obligations, eliminate racism, racial discrimination, and other violations of human rights, and guarantee effectively the legal rights of ethnic minorities. At the same time, it should stop using human rights as a political tool and practicing double standards internationally. We call on the international community to converge on the full implementation of DPRK and the support for greater efforts of HRC and OHCHR to combat racism, so as to promote jointly the international anti-racism cause. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we'll take one last speaker for today. I'm sorry for the others. We'll have to continue tomorrow. So the floor goes to Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you, Madam President. The recent protests in the United States and in many other countries recall for us the importance of protecting all human beings and to strengthen our commitments to protect the human rights of all without any discrimination whatsoever. Despite the well-known commitment of the United States to protect human rights, Switzerland is concerned by the disproportionate use of force by members of law enforcement against the Afro-American population of the country. Switzerland calls on all countries, including the United States, to provide effective, equitable protection against discrimination and police force, regardless of gender, political opinion, origins, sexual identity, other forms of identity, and the color of their skin. Switzerland recalls the importance of international treaties ratified in this area by a number of countries. We call on all states to continue to protect the rights to peacefully protest. We speak also on the protection of the rights to protest, which will be presented again during the next session. Thank you.
And as I said, this was unfortunately the last speaker for today. So we'll reconvene tomorrow at 10 o'clock in this assembly hall here to continue the urgent debate and take action on the draft resolution. This will then be followed by the continuation of the interactive dialogue with the independent expert on Mali, which we were not able to conclude this morning. Thank you very much. I hereby declare closed the 40th meeting of the 43rd session of the Human Rights Council. Good evening to all of you.